Welcome to the Dialogue by Wirepoints, connecting the dots between our economy, government, and people. And now your hosts, Ted Dabrowski and Mark Glennon.
Well, hello, this is Ted Dabrowski from Wirepoints, and I'm joined by Mark Glennon, my partner at Wirepoints, and we're excited to bring you our next edition of the podcast, The Dialogue. And today we have a special guest with us, Paul Vallas. And I'll introduce Paul in a second, but Paul's here, and we're going to talk about school choice. And school choice has become it's been a hot button for a lot of people for a long time, but what's happened since COVID came around and all that it's opened up, all the issues that COVID has opened up, whether it's critical race theory or the masks and mandates and school closures, suddenly there's a huge interest in whether the unions and the school districts and the administrators and the system have too much power over the people, over parents, and their kids' education. And so we thought that it'd be timely to bring Paul on the show and discuss that. And the reason Paul's a great guy to talk about this is Paul, back in the day, was the Chicago Public Schools head from 1995 to 2001. He's had stints at managing the school districts in Philadelphia, New Orleans, Haiti, Chile, Bridgeport, Connecticut. So he's been in a lot of jobs in that. He's also run for mayor here in Chicago, ran for governor back in 2002. So and he's not just a political guy. He's a wonk. And if you listen to Paul will throw out all kinds of numbers and he's got lots of ideas. Some that that we might agree with, and others that we think are whatever, different. But we're glad to have him on. Paul, what did I leave out in that introduction that you might want me to add before we get into some deeper discussion on this?
Well, since the subject is school choice, we were one of the first major urban districts to open charter schools in Chicago, of course. In 95, the state authorized 15 charters for Chicago. And of course, in Philadelphia, about a third of our schools were charters or non-traditional public schools. And of course, New Orleans is the nation's only 100% school choice district. So all the public schools are, in effect, charter schools, or what I call freestanding, independent, autonomous schools, governed by a very limited but nevertheless potent accountability system. And of course, New Orleans also has vouchers, so they provide parochial school, parents who want to send their kids to parochial school. So given the relevancy of that experience to this, to the subject matter, I thought I might mention that.
Paul, Mark Glennon here. Thanks for coming. I opened up Real Clear Politics today, and two headlines there say that schools and parental unhappiness with schools is now a major issue around the country. Even Politico, a left-leaning piece, is acknowledging that it certainly goes beyond Virginia. It goes beyond critical race theory. Parents seem to me to be really waking up that there's a big problem in our educational system. You have better political skills than I do. Do you sense, too, that there's a tide turning towards some kind of major school reform here and across the country?
Yeah, I believe that there's a great deal of momentum for kind of revitalizing the school reform movement. Let me point out, though, that if the Republicans are going to sweep both the House and the Senate and potentially the presidency in the next election, I believe it's going to be because the Democrats have overstepped in their support of the labor unions, and because of the price that families have paid for the schools, in effectively shutting down their campuses for all practical purposes for literally 12 months. And it's done tremendous damage. That and obviously some of the other initiatives that have been pushed that are not focused on improving the quality of instruction or making the standards more rigorous. I think that there's going to be a political price to pay. That said and done, if you look at the national movement, there are at least at last count 17 states that during COVID have gone out and they have either created or expanded their school choice programs. I'm not talking about charter schools. I'm talking about funding for private schools. Neighboring Indiana just expanded their voucher program to cover 90% of the of the Indiana residents and to cover 90% of the tuition to those schools. So clearly, the movement is in that direction. And the National Charter Alliance just came out with a report. It was published by the Progressive Policy Institute, founded by David Osborne. And they point out that in the last year, public schools have lost 1.7 million students. By contrast, last year alone, parochial schools, private schools, their enrollment grew by 8%. And the enrollment in the Archdiocese schools this year is up 8%, where the Chicago Public Schools have lost, 26,000 students over the last 2 years. So clearly, people are voting with their feet. And, if we look at the election in Virginia, that election was lost basically because of, on the school issue, public school issues.
Sure. And for Illinois, of course, this is a statewide issue, but let's go straight into the belly of the beast first. You ran the Chicago public school system from 1995 to 2001. What were things like then, and how does it compare to what it's like today?
Well, very quickly, when we came in 1995, the district was on the verge of bankruptcy. Bill Bennett had come to town a number of years earlier, called it the worst district in the country. And of course, that's how the mayor got control of the schools. But in effect, we left a district that had close to 100,000 more students today enrolled in traditional public schools than are enrolled in traditional public schools now. The enrollment when I left was 434,000. That next year it reached 440,000, where it peaked, and now it's 327,000. So so that's a significant decline in enrollment. Of course, thanks to COVID and massive property tax increases by Rahm Emanuel, the district finances have improved. But let me point out, when we left the district with 6 balanced budgets, 12 bond rating upgrades, and about $1 billion in cash balances. But more importantly, the district was growing. The charter school movement was at its infancy, and it was expanding. And our test scores had grown for 6 consecutive years. And our strategy was to, in effect, redesign our budgets so that they were school improvement vehicles. Every budget had to be a long-term, had to be part of a 5-year budget financial plan, and then to prioritize our resources so that we were pushing resources down to the local school level. We were expanding parental choices through things like charter schools, et cetera. But what we were also doing was we were working with individual schools to increase standards and to expand the traditional public school offerings. So we were both creating non-traditional school choice and traditional public school choice. But proof is in the pudding. The only 6 years that enrollment has grown since 1979 were my 5 years and the year that followed. And I think it was because of those reforms.
So Paul, I feel like this is Groundhog Day because, when you took over, the place was bankrupt. We know that there were changes that happened in the 80s because the school district was such a mess. And here we are now. As you mentioned, it's the enrollment has shrunk by 100,000 students since 2000. So it's whatever that is. I forget the percentage. It's massive, over 25%. So the question is, and we get tired of talking about it, but just a few weeks ago, Mayor Lightfoot came out and said that CPS graduation had hit a record 84%. And, there was a lot of celebration going on around that. And of course, we had Wirepoints. We immediately went to the Illinois report card and said, wait a minute, that doesn't square up with what we know about reading abilities and math abilities. If you go to the Illinois report card, there it is, click on the SAT scores, and about a quarter of the kids at CPS in 11th grade can read or do math at grade level. The rest can't. And so you can't have it both ways. You can't have kids that require, when they go to community college, they have to go to remediation. Most of them, 60% of them do. You can't have that and then at the same time say 84% can graduate. So before we talk about school choice, what the heck is going on there? What is the landscape at CPS today?
Well, it seems, whether it's criminal justice or for that matter education, we seem to be moving away from standards, moving away from accountability, moving away from consequences for ineffectiveness, whether it's bad behavior on the criminal justice side or it's school underperformance on the academic side. It seems like we're abandoning those things. And look, the biggest issue in 1995 was my elimination of social promotion. They had promoted an entire generation of kids. Like I remember our first year, we had looked at data the previous year, and like 80% of the kids who had been promoted into high school were reading at the sixth grade reading level or below. And of course, the numbers graduating from high school and then moving on to college or community college or not going to school. I mean, those gaps were even broader. They seem to be returning to that because, Ted, just as you pointed that out, I think 25% of the kids are meeting standards, state standards. When you pull out, for example, Black students, the statistics are actually much lower. And, there was an analysis done of SAT scores, of course, technically the college entrance exams, if you could call them. And the results are literally parallel. Even though the state has a very low SAT standard for what they consider to be meeting state standards, they have a very low SAT standard. Only 25% of the kids in the Chicago public schools are meeting that standard. Only 15% of the Black kids in Chicago public schools. And as you pointed out, this is just not a Chicago phenomena. This seems to be a phenomena in other areas of the state too. Abysmal test scores, yet surprisingly high graduation rates. So
yeah, it's the same in Decatur, Rockford. It doesn't matter where you go. It's the same. It's a state board of education problem.
And look, how many? I mean, it was amazing. The Progressive Policy Institute did this other study they've been working on, and I've been having conversations with them state by state, and they've been looking at these districts across the nation that have just these abysmal test scores. Yet the schools are all rated highly. Look, 75% of the schools, I think it's 75%, maybe more, the schools in Chicago are rated by the state as like the schools that are not on probation, schools that are, that are making the grade by state definition. So we, abandon all hope, or I should say abandon all standards, because we seem to be moving towards a standard-less school system where there is no consequences for failing schools, no consequences for ineffective teachers, no consequences for the students not learning.
Paul, let me ask a more pessimistic kind of question. I remember Mike Royko writing a column many decades ago, before you were around, saying basically that the problem with Chicago public schools is that the parents are worthless. I mean, it was some kind of blunt Royko language like that. You obviously are more optimistic that regardless of parents, and they need to do a better job, obviously, but it can be improved, in your view, I take it, notwithstanding poor performance by the parents as well. Is that right?
Yeah, it can be, because let me tell you what's happened. Clearly, families there are serious challenges that families face. My approach was to try to compensate for the inadequacies at home. I mean, we even went so far as to develop what we called a parent checklist. I called it a parent report card. So we could literally provide parents with guidance. And in today, when you have the internet and you have this capacity, and most families are connected, the ability to connect with families and to guide parents and to sometimes give them instruction, I mean, it's unprecedented. The ability to communicate with parents. Our approach to communicating with parents, I mean, particularly that we're not engaged, was to go door to door, literally. But yes, there are challenges. There are absolutely no doubt about it. But that's why the schools get the big bucks. That's why Chicago gets 40% of the Title I money. That's why Chicago's gotten $2.8 billion in the COVID dollars, which is distributed based on the poverty formulas. That's why the district is spending $28,000 per pupil, and when you adjust for the operating budget, I actually think, Ted, it's closer to $21,000 or $22,000. But the bottom line is so you do that so you can compensate, so you can have a much more comprehensive early childhood program, so you can have a longer school day, so you can have a longer school year. But what's changed? We're paying 3 times as much in property taxes as we paid 20 years ago when I left the district. I think we're paying $11,000 per kid in property taxes back in when I left. When I ran against Rod Blagojevich, we're spending $3,400. And have we added a minute or a second to the school day, or a minute or a second to the school year? I mean, what have we done to increase the instructional time on task? we dramatically improved test scores in Philadelphia and in New Orleans. In New Orleans, considered one of the worst districts in the country, we dramatically improved test for 7 years. New Orleans led the state in improved academic performance. Why? Because I was a genius? No. Because of school choice, partially, but also because the schools were these independent, autonomous schools. They were able to have longer school days and longer school years. The kids were in school 35% more time on average than what was mandated by the state. So that alone had a dramatic difference. But you can't do that now. Sorry.
Paul, that some people hear you and say, wait a minute, I don't think we want our kids spending even more time at CPS schools. That can make things worse. So, and that's a sad statement, but I think many people would say that. Yeah. Unless of course there was something different about the union contract and about how they were teaching. So one of the things that I've spent time on is looking at this third grade reading results, because you've done some good work about talking how like the Cristo Rey schools, how those Catholic schools, they take kids and put them to work part of the time they're in school. And, I got to know Preston Kendall up in Waukegan and the Cristo Rey school up there. And, he's a great guy and I love what they do up there. My concern is in CPS, if you try to do that, well, there's too many kids who can't read when they're coming out of third grade. So they won't be good workers when they're juniors and seniors in high school. So my question to you is this: have you thought about this? And this is a conundrum in a way, but you talked about social promotions, and this is what they do in Decatur and Rockford and in CPS. Just look, they can't do their work, but we got to promote them because if not, they're going to be too old for their grade. In Florida, they passed a third grade reading law. And I can't remember what year they passed that, but basically they said, look, if the kids can't meet or exceed and read at grade level in the third grade, they will not go to the fourth. And the whole point of that was to create a massive attempt at spending lots of time. Now, to your point, right. If a kid can't read, we're going to spend extra time in the school. We're going to bring all of our resources together so that before that kid goes to fourth grade, he or she is reading at fourth grade.
Right. So let me.
Tell me what you think about that.
Let me tell you what we did. That's when we ended social promotion, the mandatory retention grades were third grade, sixth grade, and eighth grade. So mandatory retention. So we kept, on the average, about 40% of the kids had to go to mandatory summer school in order to get promoted to the next grade level. They had to be an extended day. We had extended day 2 hours a day, 1 hour of instruction, the second hour of recreation, nutrition, stuff like that. But then we had a 6-week, 6-hour day summer school program. But the bottom line was it was transformational. Actually, the number of third graders participating in the bottom quartile went from 52% to 24% in a period of 6 years. So that means kids were moving. They were moving toward the middle. They were moving toward grade level. These are the silver bullets. There's no substitution for having these things. There's no substitution for having an aggressive, standardized, data-driven instructional program. Because of the mobility that exists within the schools, there has to be consistency. That's number one. Number two, there's no substitute for instructional time on task. In Philadelphia, we tripled math scores and doubled reading scores across all demographics in 6 years. And it was because of those two things, the standardized curriculum and the data-driven instruction and the instruction time on task. All our charter schools had data-driven instruction. The third thing, and what that means is that if the kids are not meeting standard, you have got to increase their instructional time. Nothing closes the achievement gap faster than more instructional time on task. The third thing, and the thing that I didn't do to scale, and if I were superintendent today, I would prioritize this, is to create the type of early childhood programs that focus on the cradle to 3. Because by the time the kids start school, even preschool at 4, they're too far behind. Too much of the brain development has occurred at a very young age. We did a program in Chicago that Daily, for some reason, gutted. We're going to try to bring it to scale, called Cradle to the Classroom, where we identified 2,500 pregnant teens a year. We provided the parents with coaches. We made sure the babies were born healthy. We got them in daycare, preschool daycare. Some of the preschool was actually home preschooling, where we'd have somebody visit the home. When the kids hit third grade, Ted, there was no achievement gap. Cornelia Grumman won a Pulitzer writing about this program and others for the Tribune. None, zero. The graduation rate among the pregnant teens was 85%. The repeat pregnancy rate was less than 1%. You have to have, so if you have universal early childhood education with the parent coaching, because you need to transform, you need to help coach and support this next generation of parents. If you then have a strong instructional program with accountability, with not having social promotion, at least having mandatory extended day, mandatory summer school for the kids that are falling behind, and if you're increasing the instructional time on task, those things can be game changers. And the district, unfortunately, has gotten away from all those things. And this is not a budget issue, it's an accountability issue.
Paul, everything you've talked about, it seems to me, is generalizable to all the schools, struggling schools across the state. They don't apply just to Chicago. But one issue where there has been a difference, I think, is critical race theory, or call it whatever you want, wokeism, right, anti-racism. That has been obviously a very controversial issue outside of Chicago for the most part. Is that, because it's hopeless in the city of Chicago that is so entrenched with the Chicago Teachers Union, and there's no hope of changing it. Give us your thoughts about that and about what the effect has been on educational standards generally.
Well, first of all, there's no substitution for constantly upgrading your curriculum. You need to do that. We had curriculum committees. We had actually an office of language and culture, and we were constantly upgrading our curriculum. We were teaching African American history year round, just not on African American History Month. And for that matter, when we taught world history, we included African history. We had, through the local school councils, the schools themselves had a lot of flexibility in terms of enhancing their curriculum. I mean, we had the Betty Shabbat schools. There are schools that had more Afrocentric curriculum. The bottom line is there's no substitution for making sure that you're teaching history and that you're teaching it adequately. But number one, when it distracts from quality instruction in the core subject areas, which it is, because we seem to be too preoccupied too much focusing on those things rather than focusing on a core curriculum, our standards suffer and damage is done. Number two, there's been a move away from accountability. You talked about what was done at the state level. Now, I guess you don't have to meet certain content area mastery standards to get certified, whatever, but there's all sorts of mandates about what you need to be learning as an instructor. That's unrelated to your ability to instruct in the core subject areas. So when you're moving away from accountability, that is a very dangerous thing. And finally, when you introduce a curriculum that is not only divisive, but a curriculum that further undermines the relationship of children with their parents, with their families, that's a dangerous thing. And for white parents, I mean, how are you going to discipline your child when your child comes home and your child has basically been told, that their generation is their race, their parents, their grandparents have discriminated against others and have somehow victimized another person's race, or for that matter, if you are a black child, how do you go home and listen to your parent when your parent has failed to be successful in addressing these historically racist institutional obstacles that have denied them a chance at equal opportunity. So I think it's this detracting from our need to focus on our core subject areas. It's allowing us to avoid accountability in terms of the quality of our teaching, the quality of our schools. And I think it's not only divisive, but I think it does damage between the children and their own parents, their own family, and within their own families.
Yeah, Paul, I often wonder, if you're a black kid, why wouldn't you become a criminal if you're hearing this stuff in school? It's, everybody with white skin is an oppressor. If you have black skin, you're the oppressed. That makes it pretty easy to justify pretty bad conduct, in my opinion.
Well, you're absolutely right. But what you're also doing, you're giving people an excuse for bad behavior. You're almost justifying. And we see that attitude. We see the attitude in the state's attorney's office. The way there's just a failure to charge people, to prosecute people, or to set bail for individuals who have long lists of felony convictions. let alone felony arrests. So you're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, why? I mean, where's the accountability? You're a victim. What's happening is it becomes a justification for everything, and I think that's a very dangerous thing.
Right. Well, let's move on to school choice, Paul. Give us an outline, sort of how it would work. What would it look like in Illinois if we implemented some kind of plan here?
Well, I think you need to do two things. School choice is both parental choice and community choice. Let me talk about parental choice first. I think I crossed the Rubicon back in 2001 when at a American Federation of Teachers convention, I was one of 5 superintendents who were on a panel discussion, and they asked a voucher question. I think I was the only one who said, I don't oppose vouchers. I mean, I believe in school choice. It's not a substitute for providing quality schools. Most of the kids are always going to be educated in traditional schools, but the bottom line is we need to be expanding choice. And what choice would look like in Chicago is there's no reason, or for that matter, the state. Remember, there are many areas of the state that do not have schools other than their traditional public schools. So obviously, there are certain areas of the state where educational choice could work more effectively than others. But the point is, the way it would work is the money would in effect follow the kids. You would have direct funding, and they have it in Indianapolis. There's at least 17 states that have some form of tuition subsidy for children who attend parochial and private schools. Let me give you an example of what it will cost in Chicago. There are 20,000 students on the waiting list right now for the Empower Illinois tuition tax break. They give companies tuition tax breaks for providing scholarships to parochial schools. If you provided a scholarship for all 20,000 of those students, the cost to the district would be about $120 million. That would be 1.4% of the district's current budget. 1.4%. I mean, this is a budget that has increased over the last 2 years by $1.6 billion. So for a reprogramming of about 20% of the school district's revenue, you could literally provide scholarships. You could provide tuition scholarship financially comparable to the income support program that the mayor is piloting in her budget. $600 a month. You could literally provide scholarships for about 20,000 poor kids whose families are waiting to take advantage of the tuition credit. So there's no reason why a modest reprogramming of money over the next couple of years couldn't allow you to migrate towards an Indiana-style school choice system. So that would be the direct funding. That would be the parental choice. But I also want to speak to the community choice because that may be of more relevancy downstate.
Well, go ahead and describe the community choice. What you mean, the choice to enroll in the program at all?
Yeah, well, no. Community choice is empowering the community to seek out a new school model. When you have a school that is not performing, it empowers the community to find a better model, whether that's finding a better traditional public school model, or for that matter, a better charter school model. There's no reason why a community should have to live with a school that has been imposed on them by a central administration who is too afraid to take on their teachers' union and do what needs to be done in that school to transform it. Now, many cities have begun to take this approach. Camden, for example, they're called the Renaissance schools. In Indianapolis, they're called the Innovation schools. In Denver, I think they also call their schools either the Innovation or Renaissance schools. But what happens is when schools are underperforming, those schools are reconstituted with no displacement of kids. The city clumsily tried to do something similar to that when they did Renaissance 2010. Ted, if you remember, their plan was to close down 100 underperforming schools and turn them over to charters and independent operators. But but first of all, they didn't select the models effectively. They were dictated by the central office, and they displaced all the kids because the kids weren't guaranteed that they could return to their home school. So that program actually was more destructive than Ron closing 50 schools, most of which were empty anyway. But that is an approach that you could take. So you're not living with a failing school. There's no obstacle to selecting a model to offer educational services that do not have the kind of collective bargaining restrictions that limit the school day, limit the school year, dictate who you hire, dictate who you fire, et cetera.
So, Paul, I've written for a very drastic solution, which is entirely reconstituting the Chicago public school system, which I think legally could be done if there were the political will to do it. It sounds like you think it wouldn't need to go that far. If you put these scholarships in place, you could leave the system that's there, and competitive pressures, I take it you think would force reforms necessary in the public schools. Is that accurate?
I'll be honest with you. I've read what you've written. I think, I believe that your reconstitution is on track. I think you have to do more than just have new programs. But in any reconstituted system, again, because your reconstitution is a separate issue, I believe the district is at a point now when you consider everything, including the unfunded pension obligations and things like that, where the system needs to be reconstituted. It really can't be fixed. It needs to be. I tried to fix it, okay, and who knows? I might have been more successful. You never can tell. Had I been superintendent to this day, but at the end of the day, I believe the system has to be reconstituted, but it has to have two features. You've got to have direct funding, and you've got to empower the community to where if they have a school in their community that's underperforming, they have to have the right to demand a better model. I think your reform needs to have those two features.
Hey, Paul, I want to make sure people understand when you say the word direct funding, that means the public money follows the kids somewhere, right?
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So my beef is we've been talking about this for a long time. School choice, and in Chicago, we talked about the decades long problems. Look, school choice is happening at CPS, and sadly, it's happening this way. People are just getting up and leaving the school system. Either they're leaving Chicago, or they're moving to the suburbs, or they're finding their way to the parochial schools. But it's happening, but it's not happening in the way it should happen, which is that people have some form of voucher or some education savings account, right, or you're using the term direct funding. So I think, and this is the real hypocritical part about the unions and about the people who oppose school choice. For me, and the work that I did in school choice in Waukegan, the real power, the tries that I made in Waukegan, the real power from school choices is giving the powers, empowering the parents to control the money, not the unions, not the union bosses with all those billions of dollars for education, right, but empowering that single mom or that grandmother who's taking care of the kid, empowering them to use the money and find a school that works for their kids. And yet the unions will stop that. They will never allow it, and neither will the politicians in power. So let's talk about the obstacles, Paul, because you've dealt with the obstacles. You've dealt with the unions. Here we are talking about school choice. What has to happen? Do we have to have the mama bears go crazy before this happens? Because you would think, given the failure of CPS, given the lack of power, that a family is so, they have zero power. How do we flip this model? And how do we get people ticked off enough that the system has to change? Because we can talk about this for another 15 years, and we're losing generations after generations of kids.
Yeah, well, the current mayor, for that matter, the next mayor, has the power to do it unilaterally. If the mayor wanted to create an Indiana-style voucher program, the mayor could do it through the city council. So that would mean having the city council votes. And look, whoever the mayor is, they're going to dominate the city council. The city council is more, obviously his priority is to protect their seats. You know what I mean? And at the end of the day, as the city even the so-called rebellious city council has voted for just about everything that Lightfoot has introduced, including her most recent irresponsible budget. But the point is, she can do that. And, the city's providing huge subsidies to a school district that is spending literally $28,000 a kid and consuming 54% of our property taxes and 25% of all the state school monies and 40% of all the federal monies. So there's no reason why the city could not pull back on those subsidies and create a Indiana style school choice system where anyone sending their kids to parochial private schools would be able to get a tuition reimbursement, or for that matter, direct funding, however that would be structured. And the mayor can do that unilaterally.
Paul, does that apply to other municipalities as well? The ability to, the legal ability to unilaterally do this, or is that just Chicago that could do that today?
Well, I think any city council could probably do that. It would probably be more difficult because most cities don't subsidize their schools like Chicago does. Look, Chicago picks up the public employee contribution portion of the pension. They provide them with 2/3 of the TIF reimbursements every year. And let me point out that when they give schools the TIF money, it's not money that they lost, because, as you well know, when the TIFs grow, the local taxing districts just their tax rates just go up to give them the levies that they requested. So at the end of the day, it's extra money. So clearly, where any city council could do that, but where Chicago has the advantage is they are literally subsidizing the schools to the tune of about $650 million a year. So you could create a system well within those financial constraints.
Paul, I was having a discussion with a reformer who's dying to bring school choice to Chicago, and he made a really good point. He says, I don't care what the laws are for school choice. I don't care how it happens. I don't care whether it's legal or not. What he says, it's only going to happen when the parents demand it, right? When enough parents understand what school choice is, because many of them don't even know there's such a thing as a direct funding or voucher or an education savings account. So what does it take, right? I mean, when you have these decades of this problem, what does it take to educate families and to make them irate enough to say, I don't want to leave Chicago. I want a better option. Give it to me now.
Well, look, my strategy is to encourage the conservative unions, the non-teacher unions, particularly the city unions. The FOP has already taken a position that they want school choice, period. I mean, they've been fighting for changes in residency requirements for years. Well, now their position in this next round of negotiations is we want vouchers. We want tuition tax breaks. 40% of the Chicago teachers don't send their kids to Chicago public schools. They send their kids to broker or private schools. I think
is it only 40%?
Well, then it was 40% when Forbes did that analysis. It's probably even more so now. But the point is here that I believe you can build a coalition. Number one, but let me tell you what's going to be critical. It's going to be critical to reach out to the unions, the city unions who are paying parochial school, private school tuition through their teeth, so to speak, to build a coalition between charter schools and parochial schools. Parochial schools are not a threat to charter schools. Charter schools are not a threat to parochial schools. You need to build a strong school choice coalition, and then to connect with that cadre of charter school parents. 1 in 4 high school kids in the Chicago public schools go to charter schools. The only reason more don't go to charter schools is because the charter schools have been capped, not only in number, but also in enrollment. So I believe that you can create a coalition, but it's gonna take the reform community raising money, mobilizing, being able to match the teachers union in the type of money that they can spend to do the public relations campaign, to support aldermen who support school choice, etc. It's going to require, but there's a pathway there. There's a pathway there because you pointed out earlier about the great exodus, people voting with their feet. WBZ did a story a couple of years ago. When I graduated high school, 50% of Chicago was middle class. Today, 16% are, and that was pre-COVID. And that is a disaster because we have truly become the tale of two cities. And I'm not even going to talk about the only reason that the middle class still remains in terms of Chicago public school parents is because of the magnet schools, the select enrollment schools, and those schools that seem to hug the borders, like the schools in Beverly or the schools in Sauganash, etc. I mean, other than that, these inner city schools on the south and west side and many areas of the city, I mean, there's virtually no middle class in those schools. So the bottom line is, I think a coalition has got to be formed. But what's critical is that the business community, organizations like the Illinois Parents Union, the conservative unions, the city and the charter schools and the parochial schools all close ranks into a grand coalition, because the teachers union finds allies. They fund these progressive groups. They hide under the banner of the progressive movement. They realized when they were losing ground 10, 15 years ago to the charter school movement, they realized that they were isolated and they needed to find allies. And that's what the unions have effectively done. We have got to take a page from the union. We need to form allies, form coalitions, and we need to push school choice.
Boy, and a big part of that coalition, Paul, has to be, as you were mentioning, the people concerned about the flight of people and the tax base from the state, from the city. Have a good school system, you'll draw in people. Have a bad school system, you'll push them off. And it's going to raise property values. It's going to bring those middle class and higher income people back into the city. It seems clear as day that that's a key part of the solution for stemming the fundamental mess that we have fiscally across the state.
Well, I like to, and it would be funny if it wasn't so sad, but the school district has lost enrollment, from 79 to 95, which was when my tenure began. They lost 110,000 students. And then 2 years after I left, they started losing enrollment again. And since then, they've lost 113,000. The school district has fewer students today than they had when the Germans were invading France to bypass the Maginot Line. And I'm not talking about World War II. I'm talking about World War I. I think it's like 1912. That's not a healthy sign. People are fleeing. The tragedy is our property taxes are unadjusted for inflation, about three and a half times higher than they were 20 years ago. And again, this is a district that consumes 54% of our property taxes, not counting the pension subsidies, so it's probably closer to 60%. 25% of all the state revenue for elementary, secondary education goes to Chicago, and 40%. The Chicago Public Schools have received close to $7,300 per pupil in COVID money since December. Have we added a minute to the school day? Have we added a minute to the school year? They just decided to give Friday off, a 4-day weekend, the so-called, vaccination holiday, to account with full pay. So the school district's headed in the wrong direction, and it needs to be reconstituted along the lines, and we can debate some of the things that you recommended, but I believe it needs to be reconstituted along the lines you articulated. But any reconstitution has to have two features. It has got to give parents choice, and because the majority of the kids will continue to be educated in so-called traditional public schools, it's got to give the community choice, like they have in Camden and Indianapolis and Denver and elsewhere, to say when that school's failing, we want a new school model, and there's not going to be any collective bargaining agreement that impedes that model from benefiting our kids.
So, Paul, it begs a question. Let me ask you, I have two questions here. One of them is, what do people like Lori Lightfoot and those people in power say? What might they say privately about school choice? And of course, I'm asking you to maybe pretend like you're hearing her speak. That's one question. Then two, people talk about you running for mayor. So why don't you address that, just so that we get that out of the way, because people will be wondering as you talk, what your ambitions are.
Or governor, president, whatever.
Well, if somebody wants to give me a healthy campaign fund to run, because as you know, it takes money to run for mayor, and unfortunately, among the powers that be, it takes money to be taken seriously. But I'm not doing this because I'm running for mayor. Look, I mean, if I was politically ambitious, I wouldn't have left the state after losing to Rod Blagojevich by 1.5% to go to Philadelphia, or I would have come back to Illinois and run for mayor when I was invited by some people, when Daley retired, instead of going to New Orleans and doing the work that I did in New Orleans. And I certainly, if I had political ambitions, would not have gone to Haiti 40 times. So believe me, if I've been charting a political course for myself, I haven't really made the best decisions. I think I'm going to heaven, but beyond that, nothing's guaranteed. But I'm not doing this because I'm running. You never say never to anything, but this is not why I'm doing this. I crossed the Rubicon on school choice 20 years ago, and New Orleans only reinforced it. And it's the only way out. It's the only way out. It's to give parents the power and the really empower communities. We pay lip service to empowering local communities. So I truly believe in this. I think this is this and public safety are the two most important issues that the city is facing right now. And I think we've got to build a coalition and drive this thing home. And there's no reason why we can't do what we follow the lead of other states that are in infinitely better shape than we are, because they've made the right decisions, and those decisions have been in the best interest of the children.
Yeah, that 2002 race, I think it was, against Blagojevich, is part of your history that I think a lot of people forget. You lost only because he slimed you and was able to get away with it. And, you still came within a hair's breadth. But yeah.
Mark, I lost because Roland Burr stayed in the race and got a mysterious loan a month before the election of about $2.5 million to keep him in that race, which of course I don't think they ever paid off. So the bottom line is clearly you can't run against the establishment without facing all sorts of obstacles. But I have no regrets. I mean, I love public service. This is an important issue, though, and I give you credit at Wirepoints to champion this. And we should have a longer discussion on your earlier piece on revamping or reconstituting the Chicago public schools, because I think there's so much merit in what you've laid out. I would like to continue that dialogue.
Well, Paul, we appreciate you championing what you do, because we believe school choice is incredibly important. Paul and I had a chance to push for opening schools in Illinois during COVID. Open New Trier was one of the things you came to and helped champion. We really appreciate you spending the time to talk to us to push for school choice. Mark and I and others who follow Wirepoints are huge believers that the system the power dynamics of schools versus parents is totally upside down. And you can figure that out from McAuliffe's statement in Virginia, right? The parents aren't allowed to choose what the curriculum looks like, and that's absolutely wrong. So thanks again for joining us, and thank all of you for joining our podcast, The Dialogue with Wirepoints.
Thank you, Paul. Take care.
Thanks, guys.